Hi, class. I hope you all are having a great day and a great semester so far. So, I am back with you today to continue our discussion of our novel, right? Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. So, in my last video, right, last week, we were focusing on part one of the novel. Okay, and I had to be very careful that I didn't give anything away, right? Because a big part of this book, something that makes it so enjoyable is the slow reveal, right? And so, very interesting on page one of the book, right? Our narrator, Kathy H., right? She introduces herself as an experienced carer, right? And she tells us, right, she prides herself on knowing how to keep her donors calm, right, even before their fourth donation. Okay, and as we're reading, right, we're kind of like, wait, what is she talking about? What is a carer? Right? What is she talking about? Donors? Okay, well, right, once we finish part one, right, and as we read on into part two, right, it becomes very clear, right, what she's talking about. Right. So, what is she talking about? Right. So, we come to learn that the students at Hailsham are actually clones, right? And that they were created with the purpose of donating their vital organs. Okay, so that is a slow build, right? A slow reveal, right? And very interesting, I think, and very brilliant on Kazuo Ishiguro's part. Because in the same way, right, that the students are told and not told, right, we are also told and not told. Right. Again, Ishiguro is very direct. Page one, carers and donors. Right. But it takes a little bit of time and a little bit of reading for us to really, understand what that means. Okay. So now that we're in part two, I don't have to be careful. I can just state it directly. Okay. So part two, right? We move to a new setting. Okay, so we come to learn that when, the students at Hailsham, when they turn 16, right, they leave Hailsham and they are taken to, different locations. Okay, so the three, main characters that Ishiguro is focusing on, Kathy, Ruth, and Tommy, right, they're still together and they are taken to a place that is called the cottages. Okay, so what is the cottages, right? Well, we come to learn that it's the remains of a farm, right? It's these old abandoned farm buildings, right? And what is different than what is different about this setting than Hailsham, right? Well, Hailsham was a very comfortable place to grow up. Right. We saw the students basically had everything they need. They had their guardians there, with them. Right. But at the cottages, it's very different. Okay, so there are no guardians, right? There's really no, authority figures, no adult, guidance there, right? They're on their own, right? And we come to see that the people who are already living there, the other clones who are there, right? They're referred to as the veterans, okay? And then we also come to see that it's not really as comfortable as Hailsham was, right? It's kind of cold, right? Kathy, describes feeling, uncomfortably cold a lot of the time. Again, remember, this is England. It gets very cold in the winter, right? And she describes, kind of bundling up with whatever's available, sometimes old curtains, right? Pieces of carpeting, right? She'll wrap around her body to try to stay warm. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, there's no, authority figures, no adults there with them, right? We know that they're young, right? They're, between the ages of, say, 16 and 18, because we come to see that they live there for approximately, 2 to 3 years. Right. But there is this adult man, this, normal human being named Kefers, right? And he comes, it seems maybe like 2, 3 times a week, basically just to drop off food, drop off supplies, right? And when he drops off gas for the furnace, Kathy, sort of suggests that, the students are kind of like, hey, can you give us some more gas? It's pretty cold. But he's really stingy about it. He doesn't, give them everything that they want. Okay, so kind of like, why? you know. Now, we also come to see that when they leave Hailsham, right, there's two things that they bring with them, kind of like, transitional objects. So they bring their collections with them, right? And then as well, they have an essay assignment. Right, the guardians, give them this essay assignment, right? And at the beginning of part two, notice how Kathy, she's really kind of happy about this essay assignment, right? Because it provides a link to her old life, right? It gives her something to focus on, something to work on, right? It's supposed to keep them busy, for 2 years. Okay, but notice how, by the end of part two, right, Kathy's feelings about the essay assignment, they change. Right at the end of part two, when she thinks about her essay, she calls it a lost cause. Right? She doesn't even finish it. Okay. And also notice the, sort of the different views on their collections, right? Their precious, items with sentimental value, right? That they've been collecting throughout their lives, right? Basically things that they bought at the sales, right? It could be other students' poetry or art, right? And kind of notice how even their views towards the collection seem to change, right? Especially Ruth's. Okay. So we also notice in part two, right, another little bit of a carryover, right, is that they're still, right, sort of thinking about what Kathy refers to as dream futures. Okay. So remember in part one, Miss Lucy had overheard students talking about, oh, when I grow up, I want to be an actress or I want to be an English teacher, whatever they were thinking they wanted to be, right? And Miss Lucy was kind of like, shutting that down, right? Well, we see in part two, right? They still, talk about dream futures, right? It's sort of like a fantasy, right? And Kathy describes it as being, something that allows them to forget, right, what their real destiny is. Okay. So, why is that important? Well, we come to see that Ruth's dream future is to work in an office, right? And that is something that she always, has sort of fantasized about, right? She pictures herself doing that, right? And what does that show us? I mean, I kind of think that it shows us that they have some hope. They have this like maybe little tiny shred of hope that maybe, right, they could actually, do something different than what they were created to do. Right. And I think that, a theme that we see in the novel is, the comfort that people sometimes find in illusions. Right. And certainly we see that when the students are thinking about their dream futures. Right. And, Ruth's dream future of working in an office that, plays an important part in part two, right? Because in part two, we also learn about what the students call possibles. Okay. So there's a lot of talk about, finding their possible. Okay. Now, as we're reading, I think initially we're wondering, what the heck is a possible? Okay. What is that? And I'm just going to page 139 if you have, a paper copy of the book, because there's a really nice, clear description of it. And so basically, she tells us, right, that the basic idea behind the possibles theory was simple, right? It went something like this. Since each of us was copied at some point from a normal person, there must be for each of us somewhere out there a model getting on with his or her life. Okay, so this makes sense, right? We know these are clones, right? What is a clone? A clone is a copy, right? So this is basically the person that they were copied from. Okay, and they're very curious, right? To know, like, who was I copied from? And I feel like this is very, like a very human-like desire, right? For example, right, sometimes people who were adopted, right, they, when they get to be older, they might go searching for their birth parent, right, their biological parent, right? Also, many people are very interested in like 23andMe, Ancestry.com, right? The idea that if we learn about where we came from, it'll help us understand, right, more about ourselves and our identities, right? This is a very normal human desire. Right. And so very interesting that these clones, they also have that desire, right? They want to know who was I copied from, right? Who was my model? Right. And Ishiguro tells us, right, this is also on page 139, chapter 12, right? Why did we want to track down our models? Well, one big idea behind finding your model was that when you did, you'd glimpse your future. At their future. Okay. And then she says, right, we to varying degrees believed that when you saw the person you were copied from, you'd get some insight into who you were deep down. And maybe too, you'd see something of what your life held in store. Okay. Now, wait a second. I thought we already know what their life holds in store, right? They were created to donate their organs, right? They know that. Okay, so why then, right? Are they thinking about their possible and, that it might say something about their future? Again, this suggests, maybe there is a little bit of hope. Okay. Now, one thing that I didn't say yet about the cottages that really stands out to me, and of course, this relates directly to the question that you'll be answering this week on the discussion board, right? So we come to see at the cottages, right? These students, they have a lot of freedom, right? Like I said, there's no guardians there, there's no authority figures watching over them all the time, right? They're there alone, basically, and they can come and go as they please, right? On page 118, Kathy tells us, this is a quote, we all knew no one would stop us if we wandered off, provided we were back by the day and time, right, that we entered into Keffer's ledger book. Okay. And then she describes, right, that, the veterans sometimes they'll, check out a car and they'll be gone for up to 2, 3 days at a time. Okay. And we also see, right, the characters that we're focusing on, Kathy and Tommy and Ruth, right, in part 2, they take a trip. They go to Norfolk. Okay. And we see again, they have a car, they have money. Okay. They're when they're in Norfolk, they're just wandering around the city, doing whatever they please. They blend in with all the normal people. What on earth, right? What prevents them from just leaving, right? If I knew that my destiny was that I was going to be laying on a hospital bed with somebody cutting me open and taking out my organs, I would do whatever I could to escape that. I would run away, right? But why don't they? Okay, it seems like they could, okay, but they don't. Okay, so that's, something I'd like you to think about. Why? Why don't they run? Okay, we'll talk more about that next week, when we get into part 3. Okay, but I'd like you to think about that. Okay, so let's say a little bit more about this Norfolk trip. Okay, so why do they, go to Norfolk? Well, we come to see in part 2, right, that 2 of the veterans, Chrissy and Rodney, right, Rodney says that when he was at Norfolk, not long ago, visiting, another, clone, that he saw somebody that he thought looked like Ruth, right? And, could this be Ruth's possible? Wow. Oh my God. And what a coincidence. This woman that he saw that looks like Ruth, guess what she's doing? She works in an office, right? Just like Ruth's fantasy. So, wow, it just seems like this could be it, right? And so they're very excited. There's a lot of like, kind of like, anxiety as well. Like, could this be it? So they all take a trip to Norfolk, right, to see if this woman in the office, is in fact Ruth's possible. Okay. And so, unfortunately, right after they, see the woman up close, right? Because kind of from a distance, when they first see her in the office, they're kind of like struck with the similarity in her appearance to Ruth, right? But then, right again, they sort of follow her when she leaves the office, walking down the streets, right? She goes into an art gallery again, of all places, right? An art gallery. And then when they're closer and they observe her more carefully, right? They see, in fact, that no, right? That this woman actually, does look a lot like Ruth, but it's not Ruth, right? The way she talks, right? It's just not the same. Okay. And that's a really, important moment in part two because we see the response that they have, right? And, more specifically, let's say a little bit more about Ruth's response, right? Because she's very, you can see, disappointed. Okay, so this is kind of like an important speech in part two, right? Where Ruth, let me just go to the page, right? It's page 166, right? And this is the moment where, this is actually the only moment in the entire book where the word clone is used, right? But we see that Ruth says, they don't ever use people like that woman, right? Think about it. Why would she want to? Okay, and then she goes on to say, right, we all know it. We're modeled from trash, junkies, prostitutes, winos, tramps, convicts, maybe, just so long as they aren't psycho. That's what we come from. We all know it. So why don't we say it? A woman like that? Come on. Yeah, right, Tommy. A bit of fun. Right. And then she goes on, right? Um, and then she's talking about the woman that they spoke to in the art gallery. What do you think she'd have said if we'd asked her, excuse me, but do you think your friend was ever a clone model? She'd have thrown us out. We know it, so we might as well just say it. If you want to look for possibles, if you want to do it properly, then you look in the gutter. You look in rubbish bins. Look down the toilet. That's where you'll find where we come from. Okay. So, this is, I think, a very sad moment. Like I have a lot of empathy for Ruth in this moment, right? Because, basically what she's saying here, right? Even if they aren't human, they weren't even modeled from, what we might call good humans, right? And not to speak too disparagingly about, the people she's describing here, but these are people who, you know, junkies, prostitutes, winos, tramps on the bottom of the social hierarchy, right? You know, these are people who are, worth less than normal people. And Ruth is saying that's what we're modeled from. Okay, so that's very interesting, I think, very telling, and also I think kind of very sad. And I do have a lot of empathy for Ruth in that moment, right? Which is very interesting because I think that in part two, my empathy for Ruth is, it's kind of challenged a little bit because I think that in part two, Ruth's character is developed in a way that makes her in my opinion, very unlikable, right? She is, shown to be very cruel, I think, right? To the people who are, her best friends, right? So, let's think about some of her, some examples of her cruelty. Okay, well, number one, we know that she is in a relationship with Tommy, right? They are a couple and they've been together, for a long time. Okay, so, they're very, close to each other. But yet, right, we come to see that Ruth treats Tommy horribly, in my opinion, right? She's very, rude to him, very disrespectful to him, right? And one example, right? When she's talking to Chrissy and Rodney, and they're talking about deferrals, and we haven't gotten to that yet. I'll say something about that in a moment, right? But he's sort of like, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never heard of a deferral, right? And Ruth is like, oh, yes, we know what they're talking about. And then she says, right, to Rodney and Chrissy, right in front of Tommy, she says, "What you've got to realize is that even though Tommy was at Hailsham, he isn't like a real Hailsham student. He was left out of everything, and people were always laughing at him. So there's no point in asking him about anything like this." Okay, like what? What do you mean he wasn't a real Halsham student? She says this right in front of him. I think that's very rude, right? And then later in part two, right, when Tommy is, starting to draw these little animals, and it's very important to him, right? He's finally, feeling more confident in his creativity and his ability to create art, right? It's very important to him. And how does Ruth, respond to these drawings, that he's creating? She makes fun of them. She says, "Oh, it's not just me, sweetie. Kathy here, also finds your animals a complete hoot." Right. So she also throws her friend Kathy under the bus, right? Not only is Ruth saying your animals are a joke, right? She says Kathy feels that way too. Right. And then she goes on, "As long as people think you're doing these little creatures as a kind of joke, fine. But don't give out that you're serious about it, please." Right. Now that I feel like that's very mean, you know. So Ruth is being like very horrible here, right, to Tommy. And also we see, right, more examples of her being very rude and cruel to her, best friend, Kathy, right, her childhood friend, right? So some examples of Ruth's cruelty to Kathy. Number one, so there's a moment in part two where Kathy, sort of like opens up to Ruth about her sexual desire, right? So Kathy is not in a couple. And so she tells Ruth, right? She kind of describes that she has, had sex with other people at the cottages, right? And she talks about this desire, sexual desire that she has, right? Which again is very normal, a very normal human thing. All humans have sexual desire. And what does Ruth say? "Oh, Kathy, that's a bit weird." Right? That's the word she uses, weird, you know, you know, that's a very, sharp contrast to when Kathy opens up about her sexual desire to Tommy, right? Later in part two, because Tommy, reassures Kathy, "I have sexual desire too. And I imagine if people are honest, they would all agree with you." Okay, so Tommy, responds to Kathy in a very comforting, reassuring way, right? Unlike, her friend who says, "Oh, that's weird." Okay. And then I think the moment in part two where Ruth is just terrible, just horrible to Kathy, her supposed best friend, is at the very end of part two, right? When Ruth is basically saying, things like, and this is on page 200 if you have the paper copy of the book, right? So Ruth says, "It would be completely natural if you thought about, what would happen if me and Tommy decided we shouldn't be together anymore? Okay, we're not about to split, don't get me wrong, but I think it would be completely normal if you at least wondered about it." Right? "Well, Kathy, what you have to realize is that Tommy doesn't see you like that. He really, really likes you. He thinks you're really great. But I know he doesn't see you like, a proper girlfriend." Okay, and then she pauses. "You know how Tommy is. He can be fussy." Right, and then Kathy, "What do you mean?" "Tommy doesn't like girls who've been with, well, this person and that. It's just a thing he has. I'm sorry, Kathy, but it wouldn't be right not to have told you." Okay. So, what is Ruth doing here? Basically, she's saying that because Kathy has had these, sort of like one night stands, these hookups with, boys at the cottages, that Tommy would never want to be with her. So, she's kind of shaming Kathy here, right, for having sexual desire and for opening up to her friend. Okay. And is this true? Did Tommy ever suggest this? No, right? So why is Ruth doing this? Again, I don't really know. I think she's doing it just to, make her friend feel bad. Again, this person is being portrayed as being, in my opinion, kind of unlikable, very self-centered, very thoughtless, right? She doesn't think about her friends' feelings. Okay. So let's say something now about deferrals, right? That is definitely, a big important part of part two, right? So, we come to hear them talking about deferrals, right? What is that, right? So it first comes up when Rodney and Chrissy, right, the veterans, right? Again, they've gone to Norfolk to look for Ruth's possible, right? And while they're there, right, Rodney and Chrissy like bring up this other subject that they wanted to talk about, which is this rumor, right? This rumor that they've heard that Hailsham students have this special opportunity, right? That, sort of like this special chance that they can apply for a deferral. Okay, so what is that, right? Well, if you think about the word deferral, right, to defer something is to like push it back, push the deadline back, right? And so the deferral refers to their donations, right? The idea that they could defer their donations by 2, 3, maybe even 4 years, okay? And how would they apply for this? What is it contingent on? Right. Well, we come to see that it is contingent on them being able to prove, right, that they are in love with another, clone. Okay. And that if they can prove, right, that they're in love, that they can possibly push their donations back. Okay. So very interesting, right? This rumor, right? And, is that true? Like, did they hear about this at Hailsham? Right? Because again, Rodney and Chrissy said this is something that applies only to Hailsham students, right? They have a special set of rules. Okay. Now, we know in part one, there was never a mention of anything like this, and that Kathy and Tommy both, don't recognize, they've never heard anything about it. Okay. But yet Ruth is pretending like, oh, yeah, yeah, right. I know what you're talking about. Okay. So, let's think about this deferral, right? Because it becomes something that sort of takes over their imagination, right? Could this be true? Right? And, if you think about it, the fact that it is contingent on love, right? If they can prove that they're in love with another clone, right? And that, of all the things, of all the qualities, right? That, whoever's going to decide if they get the deferral, of all the qualities to base this on love, right? Very interesting, right? The idea that love is what makes you human enough to live, a few more years, right? To actually have the opportunity to live a few more years, right? This really does show, right, that it prioritizes feeling, emotion, love, right? And also monogamy. Okay. It's not based on them proving, say, their IQ, right? Or proving, say, their athletic ability, right? Or even proving how good they are at art, how creative they are, right? I feel like those are all things that in the real world, people, we judge people, we value people based on things like their IQ, their athletic ability, and even their ability to create a work of art. we don't really judge people's value so much based on whether or not they're in love with somebody else and they can prove it, right? So that the idea that this deferral would be based on love, I think is very interesting. Okay. And then, of course, we see in part two, this, causes a lot of anxiety in Tommy, for example, right? Because he, starts to wonder, how are they going to prove, how would we actually prove this, right? And then he starts thinking, right? Again, Tommy and Kathy, they're always very curious. They're trying to figure things out, right? And we see, right, that Tommy's, comes up with this theory, right? He calls it his gallery theory, right? So he starts thinking about the role of art, right? And he starts remembering, right, things that he overheard when he was at Hailsham, right? So, for example, right, he remembers overhearing, um, you know, Miss Emily tell another student, right, that art, right, was a way of providing evidence. Okay, so he's sort of like, evidence, you know, what exactly do we mean by that? So he remembers Miss Emily saying to Roy, and this is on page 175, right? She told Roy that things like pictures, poetry, all that kind of stuff, she said they revealed what you were like inside. She said they revealed your soul. And so, what does that mean? They revealed your soul. Right. Okay. So, what is a soul? A very difficult thing to define, right? All of us, we have a physical body, right? But like your soul refers to sort of like your essence, right? What makes you unique, right? And so he's saying that this art is important because it reveals that, right, about them. It reveals their soul, right? And then he goes on, he's telling Kathy, right? So this theory that he has. So he says, then you see, Kathy, there has to be a way to judge if they're really telling the truth, that they aren't just saying they're in love, just to defer their donations. You see how difficult it would be to decide, right? So he comes up with this idea, right, that is why Madame was always taking their best art, right, to put in the gallery so that she would have, right, this tangible evidence, right, to reveal, right, what each of these clones' individual souls was like, he says. And then he tells Kathy she can find the art they've done over the years. She can see if they go, if they match. Right? Don't forget, Kath, what she's got reveals our souls. She could decide for herself what's a good match and what's just a stupid crush, right? And now Tommy's feeling very worried, right? Because he remembers that when he was at Hailsham, he didn't have any art put in the gallery, right? And now he's feeling like he missed that opportunity, right? The thing about being from Hailsham was that you had this special chance. And if you didn't get stuff into Madame's gallery, then you were as good as throwing that chance away. Okay. So that is why, right, we come to understand in part two, right, that is why Tommy starts to draw, right, these animals, right? So he gets these sketchbooks and he starts creating art, right? These little pencil sketches of animals. Okay, and that's on the quiz, right? Okay. So, right, that is something that's keeping him very busy, right? And again, we saw that Ruth, was very, very condescending about that, right? Thought the animals were a joke. Okay. Whereas Kathy, right, she, doesn't say anything like that to Tommy, and she actually comes to really admire these animals. Okay. And think that they're very, good pieces of art. Okay. Okay. So what else is significant about this deferral? Well, I think it's very important, right? Because it shows us something about these people, these clowns, right? That they wish they could push back the donations, right? It does show that they have hope, right? If given a choice, start the donations tomorrow or get a deferral and push it back a couple of years, they would much rather have the deferral and push it back a couple of years, right? They like to live, they like being alive, and that they have some hope. Okay. Right now, we know that this is just a rumor, right? There's no tangible evidence to support the idea that the deferral exists, right? This gallery theory that Tommy has, it's just a theory, it's a rumor. Okay. So kind of be thinking about that as, as you read. Um, and then just one last thing I'll end with, right? Again, the discussion question for this week, right? Why don't they run? Right? Why don't they try to escape their fate? Okay. Well, we're kind of thinking about the way in which these students have been, indoctrinated, right? Sort of, Miss Lucy's phrase, told and not told, right, about their purpose in life. Okay. And they accept it. We've seen that. Right. But we also can say there are some examples in the book of them challenging the rules and questioning things. Okay, so an example, right? When they go to Norfolk to look for Ruth's possible, right? After, it's kind of disappointing they don't find the possible, right? But yet, what do? Well, we come to see that Chrissy and Rodney are like, oh, while we're here, we want to go visit our friend, that is a carer now. He's living in an apartment. And, Kathy's like, oh my God, we're not allowed to do that. That's against the rules. We can't do that. And Chrissy and Rodney and Ruth are like, yeah, you know what? We don't care about the rules. We're going to go see him anyway. So they break those rules, right? Very interesting that Kathy and Tommy don't, right? That's when they go looking for the cassette tape, right? That they find. And again, this also is really, I think, this love triangle that I described in part one, right? Again, Kathy, we see, has really strong feelings for Tommy. And, as we read on in part two, we see that Tommy also has, feelings for Kathy, right? He wants to find that cassette tape for her, right? He goes out of his way to go looking in shops to see if they can find it. Okay. So, that suggests that he really cares, right? And in that moment when they're looking for the cassette tape at Norfolk, right? It's kind of the happiest moments in the book, right? Kathy is extremely happy, right? Spending that time wandering in the store with Tommy, right? We really get a very strong sense of the connection, right? That they share, the affection that they feel for each other, right? As well as I had mentioned, when Kathy opens up to Tommy, right? Because he asks her, why are you looking in porn magazines for your possible? Right. And when Kathy opens up and talks about, right, she thought that her possible maybe would have been, a woman that was in a porn magazine because of her, sexual desire, the sexual urges that she has. And we see the way Tommy responds in a way that is very kind, right? He's very comforting. He reassures her, right? She's crying, she's emotional, right? Very different than the way Ruth responded. Okay. So I think that Ishiguro is doing a really good job, right, with that love triangle, right? As I'm reading part two, I keep thinking to myself, right, I wish that Kathy and Tommy would get together. I'm sick of Ruth, right? I don't even know what Tommy sees in Ruth and what Ruth sees in Tommy. Okay. But yet I see that Kathy and Tommy, right, they are really suited for each other, right? And again, we're kind of, as we're reading, we're rooting for them to get together. Okay. Well, I'm going to end this now. I hope that you are enjoying part two, right? I really look forward to, reading your response to the question on the discussion board, right? There is no, right answer. I just am curious to know, like, what your thoughts are about why, right, they don't run. Okay. Well, I'm going to end this now. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you next time.